In this episode, we start by building a clear picture of what network security controls are supposed to accomplish in a payment environment and why having controls is not the same thing as controls that hold. New learners often picture network security as a fence around a company, but payment systems are more like a set of rooms connected by hallways, doors, and shared utilities, and the real question is whether the doors stay locked in the right way every day. In the payment card industry, PCI context, strong network controls protect the cardholder data environment, CDE, by limiting pathways, reducing accidental exposure, and making it harder for attackers to move from less trusted areas into the systems that touch cardholder data. This is not just about stopping strangers from getting in. It is about reducing opportunities for mistakes, misconfigurations, and quiet, temporary changes that become permanent weak points. When your controls hold, the network behaves predictably even when people are busy, systems change, and something unexpected goes wrong. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A mature way to approach network security is to focus on outcomes rather than on any single device or technology, because the exam and real security both care about results. The core outcomes are straightforward. Only approved traffic should reach sensitive systems. Only approved systems should be able to talk to each other. And every connection that matters should be visible enough that misuse is detected quickly. Those outcomes depend on clear boundaries, which is why earlier work on scoping and data flow mapping matters so much, since you cannot protect what you cannot name and trace. Beginners sometimes assume that if a network is complicated, then complexity itself is a sign of strength, but complexity often hides gaps because nobody can confidently explain what is allowed and why. Robust controls usually look boring on purpose. Limited pathways, clear rules, and evidence that those rules are enforced. The most important habit is to treat every allowed connection as a deliberate decision that must be justified, documented, and maintained. Before you can build controls that hold, you need to understand the difference between controlling connectivity and controlling trust, because networks often create trust in ways people do not notice. Connectivity is the ability to send traffic between systems, but trust is what happens when a system is allowed to authenticate, administer, or influence another system in ways that matter. A network might block most traffic while still allowing a management path that provides high privilege, which means the trust relationship remains strong even if the number of open connections is small. In ACDE context, this matters because attackers often look for a single trusted pathway, such as an administrative access route, rather than trying to break through a well-guarded perimeter directly. Robust network security controls address both layers by restricting traffic and by limiting the trusted routes that can change or control sensitive systems. If you can explain how a path could be abused, you can explain why it must be narrowed, monitored, and protected. This way of thinking keeps you from declaring victory based on surface-level restrictions. Network segmentation is one of the most important control strategies for payment security, but segmentation only works when it is paired with disciplined traffic control between zones. The practical goal is to create a dedicated zone for the CDE and to ensure that everything outside that zone has only the minimum necessary connectivity into it. That minimum is not based on convenience. It is based on what the payment flow requires and what operational support truly needs. Beginners sometimes imagine segmentation as simply placing systems on different address ranges, but the real control is in enforcing the boundary so that traffic does not cross unless it is explicitly permitted. When robust controls hold, there are no surprise shortcuts, such as a forgotten connection through a shared service network or an unreviewed rule that was added to fix a business outage. You should be able to describe not only the boundary, but also the few approved bridges across it, including why each one exists and what would happen if it were misused. That clarity is what makes segmentation defensible rather than decorative. Another core idea is the principle of least connectivity, which is the network version of least privilege, and it is often the difference between a clean environment and a messy one. Least connectivity means systems should not be able to talk to each other just because they are on the same network, and it also means you resist the temptation to allow broad access, just in case. In practice, broad access becomes permanent because it avoids immediate troubleshooting effort, but it creates long-term risk because attackers can use it as a movement path. The safer approach is to start from deny by default thinking for sensitive zones, then intentionally open only what is needed for a specific business function. Beginners sometimes worry that this will break things, but that concern is exactly why disciplined testing and change management exist, because you can validate what is required without allowing everything. When controls hold, the allowed connections remain small enough that you can monitor them effectively and notice when something changes. This is how you prevent the CDE from becoming reachable through a growing maze of exceptions. A robust network security posture also depends on clear ingress and egress thinking, meaning you care about what comes into the CDE and what leaves it. Ingress controls limit who and what can initiate connections into sensitive systems, which reduces the chance of unauthorized access and limits external attack paths. Egress controls are just as important, even though beginners often overlook them, because data theft frequently involves outbound movement, such as exfiltration to an external destination. If a compromised system can connect outward freely, an attacker can pull data out quietly, and the damage can continue even if the initial compromise was small. In the payment world, controlling outbound traffic from sensitive zones helps reduce the chance that cardholder data or authentication secrets can be sent off-network without detection. Holding controls means you can explain which outbound connections are legitimate, such as connections to known payment services, and which are not. When you treat outbound pathways as part of the security boundary, your network controls become more complete and more realistic. A major reason network controls fail over time is that administrative access paths are treated as special and therefore excluded from the same discipline applied to normal traffic. Management access is often high privilege, and it is frequently the path that turns a minor incident into a major compromise. Robust controls, therefore, include a careful approach to how administrators reach CDE systems, where that access originates, and what the network permits along that path. Even without getting into configuration steps, you can understand the principle that administrative access should come from a limited, controlled place rather than from any workstation on a general corporate network. You also want the administrative path to be visible, because high-privilege access should never be a blind spot. Beginners sometimes assume that if an admin is trusted, then the admin path is safe, but compromised admin devices and stolen credentials are common real-world threats. Controls that hold treat administrative access as a key risk boundary that deserves extra restriction and extra oversight. Visibility and monitoring are the next essential component, because a control that blocks traffic is helpful, but a control that blocks traffic and tells you when someone tries to break the rules is far more powerful. In network terms, monitoring helps you detect scanning, repeated access attempts, suspicious connections, and unusual patterns that indicate misuse or compromise. For new learners, it helps to remember that good security is not only prevention, it is also fast detection and response, because no environment is perfect. Monitoring should be connected to the zones that matter most, especially the boundaries around the CDE and any key pathways into it. When controls hold, the monitoring story matches the connectivity story, meaning you are watching the places you intentionally allowed and the places you intentionally blocked. Beginners sometimes focus monitoring on whatever is easiest to collect rather than what is most important, but the goal is to observe meaningful choke points. A network control is stronger when it is paired with the ability to notice pressure against it. A helpful way to avoid beginner confusion is to distinguish between policy and enforcement, because network security often fails when policy exists but enforcement is inconsistent. Policy is the statement of intent, such as the rule that only certain systems may reach the CDE on certain paths. Enforcement is the reality that the network actually blocks everything else, including unexpected paths created by new systems or new vendor access methods. The gap between policy and enforcement is where scope errors and data exposures grow, because people rely on what they believe to be true rather than what is actually true. Controls that hold are designed so that enforcement is automatic and verifiable, rather than dependent on people remembering what the policy said. This is why validation, like checking that boundaries still behave as expected, is part of network control maturity. Beginners sometimes view validation as extra work, but it is the work that turns a policy statement into a defensible security outcome. When you can explain how enforcement stays aligned with policy over time, you show real understanding of what robustness means. Change is the silent enemy of network security controls, which is why change management is not just a paperwork process, but a technical safety control for the CDE boundary. Networks change when new systems are added, when applications are updated, when vendors need access, or when teams respond to outages by creating exceptions under pressure. Those changes are normal and sometimes necessary, but they can also weaken boundaries if they are not reviewed with the CDE in mind. Controls that hold include a habit of asking how a change affects scope, data flow, and trust paths, rather than treating the network as a set of unrelated updates. Beginners sometimes assume changes are small and therefore safe, but a single rule change can open a pathway that bypasses segmentation entirely. The robust approach is to ensure changes are deliberate, documented, and checked against the intended network model, especially at the boundary of sensitive zones. When change is managed as a security activity, not just an operational activity, the network stops drifting into a more permissive state. Another reason controls fail is over-permissioning for convenience, and this often shows up as broad, any-to-any thinking that is later justified as necessary for business. Robust network security includes the discipline to ask which specific systems need to talk, for what specific reason, and under what specific constraints, so that the answer becomes precise rather than vague. Precision matters because it makes both enforcement and monitoring more effective, and it also makes troubleshooting clearer when something breaks. If everything is allowed, you cannot easily detect misuse because there is no meaningful line between normal and abnormal. If only a limited set of pathways is allowed, abnormal activity stands out, and the CDE boundary is easier to defend. Beginners sometimes fear that precision makes operations slower, but the alternative is a network where the security story is unknowable and therefore unprovable. Controls that hold often reduce operational chaos over time because they create predictable, stable pathways that teams can rely on. When you treat connectivity as an intentional design, you avoid the sprawl that makes security fragile. It is also important to connect network security controls to data handling concepts like tokenization and truncation, because robust networks and reduced data exposure work together to reduce risk and scope. If your architecture minimizes where the primary account number, PAN, ever appears, the network pathways that could carry sensitive data become fewer and easier to protect. If fewer systems handle sensitive data, fewer systems need privileged access to sensitive zones, and the boundary around the CDE can be tighter and simpler. At the same time, network controls provide a safety net when data minimization is not perfect, because they limit how far an accidental exposure can spread and how easily an attacker can reach sensitive components. Beginners sometimes treat these topics as separate chapters, but in a real environment, they reinforce each other. Good data design simplifies network security, and good network security supports safer data handling. Controls that hold are usually part of a consistent architecture story where the network supports the intended data flow rather than fighting against it. When you can explain that relationship, your understanding becomes more integrated and more exam-ready. Shared responsibility with service providers also affects network security controls in a way beginners should take seriously, because external access and external dependencies can become the weakest links. If a provider manages part of the network, hosts systems, or needs remote access into CDE components, the boundary includes not only internal decisions, but also provider processes and evidence. Robust governance means you understand what connectivity exists between you and the provider, what controls enforce that connectivity, and what proof shows the provider's side is secured appropriately. It also means you understand how provider changes are managed, because a provider can introduce new pathways through updates, support tooling, or infrastructure shifts. Controls that hold do not depend on blind trust. They depend on clarity about what is allowed, who is responsible for maintaining it, and how you detect drift. Beginners sometimes assume provider involvement simplifies security because experts are involved, But provider involvement often adds complexity, which means discipline becomes even more important. When you can describe provider seams as network boundaries that require explicit control and validation, you are thinking like someone who can defend the CDE in a modern environment. By the end of this lesson, the big takeaway is that robust network security controls are not defined by having a long list of restrictions, but by having a clear, defensible model of connectivity that stays true over time. You protect the CDE by limiting pathways with least connectivity, by treating administrative access as a high-risk boundary, and by controlling both inbound and outbound movement so sensitive zones are not reachable or leak-prone. You pair enforcement with monitoring so you can detect pressure against the boundary, and you treat change management as part of the control so the network does not quietly drift into a more permissive state. You also connect network design to data flow and shared responsibility, because the network is only as strong as the architecture and relationships it supports. When your controls hold, you can explain what is allowed, why it is allowed, how it is enforced, and how you know it is still true today. And that ability to defend the boundary is exactly what PCI expects from someone responsible for protecting payment environments.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.